The more I read, the more I like the recent hiring of Chad Scott as the Texas Longhorns running backs coach. What are the Horns getting with their latest hire? Can the Texas run game get better in 2025? We'll discuss on today's edition of the BK Show. What's up, guys and gals? Welcome in to another edition of the BK Show. This is your one-stop shop for Texas Longhorns content on YouTube. I'm your host, BK Brad Kellner. We'll get into Chad Scott's resume and background in a moment. But first, I want to try to calm the nerves of any Texas fan out there that isn't real thrilled with this hire. And by the looks of things on social media, it seems like there are at least a few of you. Steve Sarkisian has done this before. He's gone a little outside the box. He's gone a little off the beaten path with some of his previous assistant coaching hires. Hasn't always been the most popular candidate. It hasn't always been the guy from the biggest school or the guy with the longest resume. Steve Sarkisian has done this before. When Stan Drayton left Texas after 2021, a lot of Texas fans freaked out. Sark hired Tashard Choice, who had only been a running backs coach for 4 years at North Texas and Georgia Tech. A lot of people questioned that hire and wondered if some guy from Georgia Tech with this little experience could replace the great Stan Drayton, who recruited Bijan Robinson and Jonathan Brooks and had a bunch of success here in Austin. I'd say things worked out pretty well with Tashard Choice, wouldn't you? When Brennan Marion left after 2022, Longhorn fans freaked out again. Oh no, we're losing this offensive mastermind, the creator of the go-go offense. What are we going to do? Sark hires Chris Jackson to replace him. Chris Jackson, who had spent a grand total of 1 year as a wide receivers coach anywhere. That was with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He had never coached in college. He had only coached wide receivers for 1 year total. And he got the gig at Texas. And Horns fans were like, who the hell is this guy? This is all we could do? I'd say things have worked out pretty well for him, wouldn't you? Recruiting, development, production, guys getting drafted in the league. I mean, Texas is probably going to have another first-round pick at wide receiver this year and a few more guys drafted from Chris Jackson's wide receiver room. What about last year when Bo Davis left after the 2023 season? Another freak out again. How are we going to replace the great Bo Davis, one of the best D-line coaches in modern college football? Kenny Baker? Who? Kenny Baker, even to this day, doesn't have a Wikipedia page. Someone ought to change that, by the way. Baker was an assistant defensive line coach for the Miami Dolphins in 2023. An assistant defensive line coach. His biggest college job was Western Kentucky. That ain't Texas. This guy was a no-name. This was way outside the box. I'd say the Texas defensive line played pretty well in 2024, wouldn't you? Despite losing maybe the two best, I'll remove the word maybe, the two best interior defensive line in college football from the previous season, the Texas D-line was sensational in 2024. Kenny Baker got the most out of Alfred Collins. He got the most out of Vernon Broughton. He turned both of those dudes into draft picks, maybe day 2 draft picks. Texas was really good there, and that was with a no-name hire in Kenny Baker in his first year. And oh, by the way, Kenny Baker just brought in the number 1 defensive line recruiting class in America in his first full cycle in Austin. So the last 3 times, and really the only 3 times that Steve Sarkisian has hired a smaller name coach from a lesser program, things ended up working out pretty well for the Longhorns. Trust in Sark. This is the guy that brought Texas out of the 12 years of suck. This is the guy that got Texas to the college football playoff for the first time. He brought Texas its first conference title in 15 years and then made it to the SEC title game in year 1. I trust him that he knows what he's doing. So, before we get to Chad Scott himself, yeah, I get it. He's not the flashiest name. It's actually the most traditional name of all time. Are you kidding me? Chad Scott? It's also one of the widest names of all time. I had to double check to make sure that Chad Scott was a brother. He is, if you're still curious. Not the biggest name that Texas talked to. Not the biggest name that fans wanted Texas to talk to. And oh, by the way, West Virginia, where Chad Scott is coming from, not the biggest program out there. Some of the other guys being discussed were at Ole Miss, at Ohio State, at Oregon, at Florida. West Virginia is not on the level of any of those schools. But again, I trust Steve Sarkisian, and you should too. All right, now the resume. Who is Chad Scott? He's 43. He's been at West Virginia since 2019. He served in various roles, including interim head coach for the Mountaineers bowl game against Memphis this season once Neil Brown got fired after a 6-6 regular season. Chad Scott's been an OC, a co-OC, a run game coordinator, and an interim head coach during his time in Morgantown. And oh, by the way, Rich Rodriguez, the guy who got the job replacing Neil Brown, liked Chad Scott enough to try to retain him on the staff. That's a good sign. That means you're doing something right. Steve Sarkisian retained Stan Drayton because he was a really good coach. That's what Rich Rod tried to do with Chad Scott. That's a good sign that the coach is really good, that the new guy still wants you. Chad Scott has some ties to the state of Texas. He actually coached at Texas Tech from 2010 to 2012, recruited a few good backs in the state of Texas to Lubbock during that time in the Tommy Tuberville era. It was a while ago, and it wasn't a great era for Texas Tech football, and Tommy Tuberville's in politics now. But he does have those ties to the state. He has coached in the state a little bit. And then you look at West Virginia's rushing stats in recent years. The Mountaineers were 27th in the country in rushing offense this past season, averaging just over 193 yards a game. Texas ranked 69th in that same stat with better running backs and a better offensive line. The Mountaineers had three different guys go for 700 yards and 6 touchdowns last season. And then 2 years ago, in 2023, the Mountaineers had the number one rushing offense in Power 5 college football. Had to double take there to remember, yeah, it was Power 5 2 years ago. I know it's changed now. But the number one rushing attack in all of Power 5 2 seasons ago. And since 2022, West Virginia has had 140 or more rushing yards in 26 of the 28 games that they've played. That's not bad at all. And only one of those seasons was in the new look Big 12, right? Without Texas, without Oklahoma. 2 of those seasons came when Texas and OU were still in the conference. Another benefit with Chad Scott, he's from Florida. That's good. You think about some of the running backs Texas has recruited from the Sunshine State in recent years. C.J. Baxter, Jared Gibson. The Horns have had success there. They don't want to lose out on recruiting in the Deep South. Tashard Choice had ties to Georgia. He had some ties to Florida as well. Sounds like Chad Scott has those ties to the state of Florida, which is really good. And the development has been there, right? The 2 boxes I'm looking to check with this hire, recruiting and development. The development has been there. We just talked about some of West Virginia's rushing numbers the last few seasons. That's impressive. One of the guys that was in that 700 rushing yards, 6 touchdown category was C.J. Donaldson, who just transferred to Ohio State. He might be their number one running back. Texas might have to see that guy in week 1 when we get to the fall. Donaldson was a 3-star tight end out of Florida. Speaking of Florida, a 3-star tight end in high school. They switched him to running back right when he got to campus. Spent 3 years in Morgantown, about 30 rushing touchdowns. 30. He had 11 in each of the last 2 seasons. Also ran for at least 700 yards in each of the last 2 seasons. So that's good. Development, recruiting, it's a good find right there. And a great eval turning a 3-star tight end prospect into a running back. West Virginia doesn't recruit incredibly well. So if you're looking for stars, like, oh, why has Chad Scott not brought in a bunch of 4- and 5-star running backs? Well, he was coaching in Morgantown. West Virginia, it's not a Chad Scott thing. They've never been able to recruit incredibly well, and they're not going to recruit anything close to the level that Texas is going to recruit at. A lot easier to bring kids to Austin, Texas, and to the University of Texas with all of the facilities and resources and money and NIL opportunities, and the list goes on that you get at UT versus what you get at West Virginia. Again, I just talked about Kenny Baker a few moments ago. That guy had 0 ties to the state of Texas. Unlike Chad Scott, he had never coached in the Lone Star State. He just brought in the number 1 defensive line class in America. Of course, NIL helps with that, but still, a no-name coach, with all due respect, with no ties to Texas high school football, or really a whole lot of high school football since he was coming from the NFL, just out-recruited every defensive line coach in the sport in his first full cycle. Chad Scott's going to be able to recruit just fine. And by all accounts, I read a lot of insider pieces over the last couple of days. Chad Scott is known for being a great guy, a relationships guy, and a guy who can recruit really well, not just for running backs, but a bunch of different positions. He's going to be just fine in that regard. So I think the Texas running back room is in great shape already. Trey Wisner back after a 1,000-yard season. C.J. Baxter back from injury. Jared Gibson back for his second year. Got Christian Clark back from an injury. James Simon, Ricky Stewart already in for the spring. That is a deep running back room, one of the deepest in all of college football The Texas run game has to be better. Chad Scott's got some work to do here. Yeah, he's walking into a great situation with talent and experience, but as much as we love Tashard Choice, he left some meat on the bone. And this Texas run game left some meat on the bone. Said it earlier, 69th in college football in rushing per game. You look at the 3 losses against the 3 best teams Texas played, twice against Georgia and then the Ohio State game. Texas averaged 1.1 yards a carry against Georgia both times. They averaged 2 yards a carry in the playoff loss to the Buckeyes. That's not good enough. So, Chad Scott, you got your work cut out for you. There's an opportunity for this run game to be better. I expect it to be better based on what Texas has coming back. And look, the red zone offense, the goal line offense, that was a struggle for Texas. I'll be honest, I'm pissed at the second and goal play call from Steve Sarkisian, the pitch to Trey Wisner, but I don't even know if Texas scores against Ohio State if they just run it up the gut 4 straight times. I would have rather seen that than what they actually did. But Sark didn't have enough faith from his run game to run it up the gut 4 straight times against an elite defense. That has to change. Yeah, you need better play calling, but you've got to have a run game that you can rely on to punch it in from 1 yard out. I'd say anything goal to go, your run game should be good enough to get into the end zone. But from a yard out, the fact that your season came to an end because you couldn't do that and you didn't have a run game that you even trusted enough to try that, chance for Chad Scott to make things better. It's obviously on Steve Sarkisian as well. A couple of quotes about Chad Scott that I've read over the last couple of days. We won't go too much longer here. Try to keep things bite-sized on this channel. Here's one from former West Virginia general manager Drew Fabianich. It's from our guy Chip Brown of Horns 24/7. He described Chad Scott as tough, focused, but he pours into his players. They respect him and play hard for him because he cares and because his players get better. It's been called an elite motivator and family man. Fabianich also said, quote, "There aren't many guys like him anymore," end quote. Called it a great fit for Texas, a great fit for Chad, a great coach and recruiter who helps develop players. And of course, he gets to work at one of the premier programs in the entire country and compete for national championships. I kind of combined paraphrasing and the actual quotes there, but that's from a guy who worked with Chad Scott in Morgantown for a couple of years. I also read this quote from Chris Anderson. No, not the Birdman, but a guy who covers West Virginia recruiting and has for a long time. Horns 24/7 had an interview with him, and they asked Anderson about what Chad Scott does as a recruiter. The quote, "He's an extremely personable guy. When you go to one-day camps in the summer, he's square in the middle of it all and talking with current players and recruits alike. On the trail, he's versatile. He hit Philadelphia and southern New Jersey while also handling most of central Florida for West Virginia. Ding, ding, ding. He would even spot recruit guys at running back if he liked them enough and filled in other spots across the country when West Virginia would go through coaching changes over the years. During his time with Neil Brown, I would say he was one of the best recruiters on the staff," end quote. So high praise from folks who have covered West Virginia and guys who worked with Chad Scott at West Virginia. Again, the more I read about Chad Scott, the more I like the hire. Yes, it's a little outside the box. Yes, it's a little off the beaten path. No, he's not the biggest name ever. No, he doesn't have the most impressive resume of every candidate that was in the mix for this gig. But I trust in Sark. He has gotten this right way more often than not. And I believe he got this one right with Chad Scott. I think he's going to do a great job on the recruiting trail. And I do believe the Longhorns' ground attack will be improved in 2025. What say you? Comment below with your thoughts. If you made it this far, number 1, thank you. Number 2, please like the video. Give that thumbs up. Number 3, make sure you subscribe to the channel and tap that notification bell so you always know when we drop new content right here on the BK Show. Tomorrow's video, we'll talk about a potential transfer. That's right. The portal's closed right now. We still got a couple of months until it opens after the spring, but there's a name that's being talked about that Texas could be interested in. Should the Longhorns do it? We'll discuss on tomorrow's video, but you'll have to wait until then. Thank y'all so much for watching. Remember, when you watch the BK Show, you rule. Talk to y'all tomorrow.